What is fascinating about it is the amount of rooms that this place has, and there are chapels in there. There are doors which act like airlocks, clearly keeping something out, whether it was people or water or even cosmic outbursts.
Who is responsible for the sophisticated engineering at Derinkuyu? Is it possible there is more to the story about who created this architectural marvel of the ancient world? For starters, alternative researchers have noted intriguing similarities between this site and other mysterious underground complexes.
The most interesting part about Derinkuyu is the fact that the upper levels are carved out almost like the same quality as the Hypogeum in Malta or the Domus Giganus tombs in ancient Sardinia. It's very sophisticated, done with extremely advanced technology. There's even a tunnel that stretches up to 5 kilometers between Derinkuyu and another underground city called Keimakli. And so we're looking at very advanced engineering, potentially from a very, very early era.
One of the fascinating things about Derinkuyu is the fact that it is not an isolated underground city. Although it is 300 feet underground and held over 20,000 or so people, it is connected to over 200 additional cities located many miles beyond where this site is. The really interesting thing is that many of the cities are built with slightly different architecture. So some of the other cities, for example, are not quite as deep, or the passages are narrower, and they have more levels of the chambers, very, very different than the minimal number of chambers that we see at Derinkuyu with the massive rooms that are there. They were connected, and it made it possible for people to live and to commute and to have commerce and trade for extended periods of time under the ground. Why would a population go through the trouble to do this unless they feared that something above the ground level threatened their existence, their survival, or their way of life?
How is it possible that humans with little advanced technological tools at their disposal created this network of underground cities stretching for miles in every direction? Alternative researchers are sure about one thing concerning this small town south of Cappadocia in the Nevşehir province of Turkey. There is an important story to tell here about our long-lost past. They believe that what happened here may not be what mainstream archaeologists have been insisting on for the last 60 years. Mainstream archaeologists have two competing theories about the age of this breathtaking site. The first considers that this city may have been constructed by the Hittite people around 3,300 years ago to help them withstand attacks from various enemies. Another equally common idea supposes that this place was constructed by the Phrygians 500 years later in the 8th century before Common Era. This theory assumes that the Phrygians, who were known to be very sophisticated architects and builders during the Iron Age, built this hideaway. But is there an alternative possibility? Could it be the age of this site goes back thousands of years before mainstream archaeologists insist, to a time before the Great Flooding of the Younger Dryas period?
Derinkuyu is the largest and the best explored of the underground cities in the central area of Turkey known as Cappadocia. And there are underground cities and dozens of other much smaller complexes, most of which have never ever been explored. But what's also important about Derinkuyu is that there's evidence that it could be as much as 12,000 years old. And this knowledge comes from the work of an archaeologist who was also the curator of Derinkuyu, whose name was Omar Demir. I went to Turkey and I found him. I said, tell me what evidence it was that convinced you that Derinkuyu could be 12,000 years old and was actually constructed by so-called Paleolithic peoples. And he took me down to the first level and he showed me the walls and he said, look, these have been cut using stone tools. He took me down into the next level and it was much cruder. He says, look here, These have been cut using metal tools, which shows that this must have happened during or after the Bronze Age. And then he gave me the key piece of evidence. On a riverbank, just a few miles away, what he found was Paleolithic stone tools amongst this spoil. And this was the key piece of evidence that told him that these structures must date back at least 12,000 years. So what's happened, of course, is that much later cultures have found this original underground complex and then dug down even further to make more and more levels, more and more floors, until you get the city that's there today.
What's really amazing, there are ventilation shafts leading from the deepest levels all the way to the top level, and there were even places in there for worship and even for livestock. So people can go down there and live down there for literally years at a time. And what's interesting is these ventilation shafts were so fine and so very small, it would have to have been some type of advanced technology to create these shafts through this tunnel. Another thing that's interesting is there is no evidence of any collapse. So what that tells us is the people were very well aware of how to work this material, how to excavate it, and it takes a lot of foreplanning, knowing how to create a structure that goes that deep, that can house and hold that much weight and that many people without collapse. So, it begs to ask the question, could this have been built by an advanced civilization millennia ago, long before anybody else stumbled across it? It seems to me that it may have been built by advanced beings that are not of this world.
If Derinkuyu is at least 12,000 years old, could there be more to the pre-diluvian story of why it was built in the first place? Alternative researchers understand not far from the Derinkuyu complex is one of the most intriguing early temple sites in the world, Göbekli Tepe, a site that has evidence showing that it was carefully buried nearly 12,000 years ago. If Derinkuyu is in fact much older than archaeologists claim, is it possible there is a connection between this site and Göbekli Tepe?
One of the unsolved mysteries of Göbekli Tepe is the fact that each of these circular temples are intentionally buried in the hillside where they are found, and that burial happened during a time when there were great cataclysms that were happening on the earth. The mystery is, were they buried to preserve what had been left or what had been created for future generations? When we look at the Younger Dryas and we look at the time that the ice was melting, the deluge occurred, if these sites were covered to protect them during the time of the deluge or during the time of the catastrophes following the Dryas, what it says to us is that they existed before those things happened. So once again, we're faced with a question. Were these sites like Göbekli Tepe, were they built during the Ice Age, perhaps during a warming period within the Pleistocene, while the Ice Age officially was still intact?
My observation of Göbekli Tepe is that it was beautifully encased, as though people were protecting it from something. It was lovingly protected with an overlapping wall of stones and then slowly filled in with material, but done in such a delicate manner, as though they're expecting, something is coming out of the sky or something is going to destroy it. And it's as though they're expecting you to come back sometime after the event and dig it up. And Göbekli Tepe is still in perfect condition. So I just put one and one together, and I figured, I wonder if there was something to do with the Great Flood. So 9,703 BC is the average archaeological and also geological date for the Great Flood. And I reasoned that if they buried Göbekli Tepe as a means of preserving it for some future date, they would have then found themselves protection inside a cave system for a considerable period of time, which really links into the cave systems in Turkey. Why are the cave systems so beautifully designed to prevent water from coming in? I mean, it's beautiful. I mean, they have these massive rolling stones, almost out of Indiana Jones, which you can move the stones from cave to cave, and they will literally form a watertight seal. That suggests to me that people were well prepared, they're well forewarned in an event, and then after the event has subsided and things are getting back to normal, that people come out of the cave and they expected to go back to their everyday lives. That makes a lot of sense as to why Göbekli Tepe would have been carefully preserved, packaged, and then people would expect it to go back, dig the whole thing up, and it would have been active just as it was before.